Thanks to Supremacy World War III for sponsoring this video. Ever wonder what it's like to command an entire nation during a modern global war? Then you've got to check out Supremacy World War III, the free online real-time strategy game that puts you in charge of a real-world country in the middle of global conflict. From managing your economy and research tree to deploying over 100 modern weapon systems like tanks, submarines and jets, you're making the big calls. Up to 100 players compete in persistent matches that unfold over weeks, so you'll have time to craft alliances, outmaneuver rivals, and see your grand strategy come to life across land, sea and air. And the best part? Supremacy World War III is cross-platform. Whether you're on desktop or mobile, your war effort never stops. Click the link in the description to play for free and get an exclusive bonus pack for new players. One seasonal unit of the main battle tank worth $25. But this offer is only available for the next 30 days, so don't wait to make your move. Fishing nets. For thousands of years, they've been used by coastal communities to harvest the living bounty from oceans and rivers. More recently, they've been a critical component in the growth of commercial fishing into an industry worth $230 billion, but have also become a major environmental problem in the process. And now they've become an increasingly ubiquitous feature on the front lines of the war in Ukraine, but they're not being used to catch fish. Instead, the Ukrainians are using them to catch drones. It's an ingenious, low-tech solution to a high-tech military problem. Let's take a closer look at why fishing nets are catching on in war and why it matters. It's late July 2025. The Russian summer offensive is in full swing across the entire front line in eastern Ukraine, stretching over 1,000 kilometers. But the most intense fighting is in western Donetsk. Here, the Russians are not concerned with personnel losses as they close in on the last major urban agglomerations in the oblast around the cities of Pokrovsk, Liman, Seversk, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and particularly Konstantinivka. The capture of these heavily fortified areas would all but seal the complete Russian capture of the Donetsk Oblast, which Russia claims as its territory since annexing the oblast in 2022. The Ukrainian armed forces, heavily outnumbered in terms of manpower, artillery, missiles and drones, have been bravely and stubbornly keeping the Russians at bay for months. However, it's Russia's growing superiority in the number of drones that it can field that is causing the biggest problems for Ukraine's defenders. The skies are saturated with the sight and sound of drones from both sides, but for now, the Russians hold the advantage in the number of fiber-optic FPV drones they can wield. This innovation, FPV drones guided by miles of fiber-optic cable instead of traditional GPS, has made a difference on the battlefield. That's because these drones can't be taken down by signal jamming and other forms of electronic warfare, at which the Ukrainians excel. There are so many active forces in the Donetsk arena that any movement of Ukrainian troops or vehicles has become extremely risky, making it a serious problem to provide frontline positions with supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements. Ukraine has been forced to use drones for resupply, particularly at dawn and dusk when its larger Vampire quadcopter drones, capable of carrying sufficient supplies to edge positions, are able to fly. A frontline commander known as Vasil told CNN, "We load 10 kilograms of supplies and it flies 12 to 15 kilometers, carrying supplies, food, ammunition, batteries, chargers for radio stations." According to Vasil, frontline positions are so vulnerable to Russian drones that mortar teams often have to walk many hours on foot, carrying 66 pounds of ammunition and equipment. In response to the fiber-optic drone onslaught, Ukrainian troops are using shotguns, machine guns, and their own FPV drones, and even scissors to cut the drones' cables and sever their guidance and control connections, all in an attempt to bring them down. But as it turns out, there's a more effective way for Ukraine to protect its crucial logistics and supply routes, and it doesn't come from military origins. The solution is to cover these routes with anti-drone netting. Provided that the netting is strong enough, it can prevent drones from striking their targets directly, causing them to explode several feet above the area and thus limiting the damage from impact. Rotor-based drones, like the ubiquitous quadcopters used by both sides, also get caught in the netting, preventing them from exploding and sometimes enabling their capture intact. As Mikhailo Ardashin, a senior soldier in the Separate Artillery Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard, puts it, even after an explosion, the net will not be destroyed or burned completely, and some fibers can still catch other drones. That's useful. However, the method is not infallible. Russia has reportedly been dropping FAB glide bombs onto roads covered with Ukrainian netting. The explosions create holes in the netting coverage, through which Russia's drone operators then fly more drones. There have been reports that sometimes the Russians fly their drones to the entrance of the netting covering and then guide their drones underneath. And sometimes, as outside Konstantinivka, residents cut holes in the nettings themselves to avoid having to walk for miles just to reach a point where they can cross the road. The Russians then identify these holes and fly their drones into them and under the netting. Now, the use of fishnets as drone protection is certainly not the only way in which Ukraine, or Russia for that matter, has been using fishing nets during the war. In fact, although most of the many military innovations that have been devised during the war have been Ukrainian in origin, the use of fishing nets as drone protection was actually started by Russia as early as 2023. Their use was first noted in the summer of 2023 near Bakhmut, where Russia began experimenting with netting to protect roads from drone attacks. Since then, the practice has expanded, and by the time of Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region, these nets were reportedly a major factor in Russia eventually being able to amass enough forces and equipment to force the Ukrainians out. Before their introduction, attempts to deliver weapons and troops into contested areas were being hammered by Ukraine's skilled FPV drone operators. Indeed, it's also been reported that by the time of Russia's summer offensive, all their main logistics routes around the ruins of Bakhmut had been covered in fishing nets. Before their installation, Ukrainian drones had been wreaking havoc on Russian attempts to concentrate forces around Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, en route through and around Bakhmut. Now North Korea is reportedly in the process of sending 1,000 sappers and 5,000 engineers to Russia, ostensibly to help reconstruct the Kursk region. However, there have been rumors on Russian Telegram channels that what they're really there to do is ramp up the construction of these nets all over the front lines. Never mind the great threat of serial deployment of Oreshnik missile systems or the ability to produce 100 Geran loitering munitions per day, the ability to stop the devastation of its equipment in transit by Ukrainian drones across the entire front line could yet prove to be a decisive factor in the war for Russia. Besides using fishing nets for protection of logistics, Russia has also been observed using netting to protect trenches and armored vehicles from drone attacks. The tanks rolling off their production lines in 2024 and 25, both new T-90s and T-72Ms and refurbished Soviet-era models, come with a protective mesh cage, mockingly nicknamed cope cages. They look more like something from an episode of the 1980s TV series MacGyver or a Mad Max film than high-tech weaponry. However, they do add an extra layer of protection, since even a couple of extra feet of distance from the drone's explosion significantly reduces its impact. Since the early days of the war, the Ukrainian armed forces have been using fishnets to cover the entrances of dugouts, bunkers, and command posts, and covering trenches in their entirety. Some units drape thick nets on the tree lines along supply routes to hinder ambushes from skilled Russian drone pilots, while others shroud their fortified positions completely in netting. Since 2022, the UAF has also been using fishing nets as a kind of scaffolding from which to hang camouflage materials. Under this netted covering, artillery, armored vehicles, and troops are effectively concealed from the ever-present surveillance drones scanning the front lines below. While Ukraine's netting serves mainly for concealment and protection of positions and equipment, Russia later adapted netting for a different purpose, as a dedicated anti-drone countermeasure along roads and vehicles, first seen in mid-2023. Now, Ukraine is also using fishing nets to protect logistics routes and needs them in ever-increasing quantities. The problem is where to get them. Russia has a dilapidated but functional fishing net manufacturing capacity and seemingly has unlimited access to large-scale imports from China, which, like almost everything else, manufactures them at scale. Ukraine doesn't have a notable fishing net industry or particularly good relationship with China, and so must source its nets from elsewhere. Fortunately, fishing nets are available, and as mentioned earlier, there's an increasingly urgent need to deal with the masses of used fishing nets that have accumulated both on the planet's surface and its ocean's floors. Even better, much of this used netting is in the hands of some of Ukraine's biggest supporters, who are only too keen to supply them. In countries like Denmark and Sweden, there are large quantities of used fishing nets that need to be disposed of. For these NATO members, what better way to deal with a tricky environmental problem than by putting it to good use defending Ukraine? The environmental problem caused by fishing nets is hardly trivial. Fishing nets are made from a variety of materials for different use cases, but overall, synthetic fibers like nylon dominate in modern fishing due to their durability in marine environments. And therein lies the problem. A major form of marine pollution is abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gear, or ALDFG for short. Commonly known as ghost gear, a significant proportion of ALDFG is abandoned or ghost nets. Ghost nets occur when fishing nets become entangled with marine obstacles, are lost during fishing operations, or simply abandoned at sea. Overall, it's estimated that 5.7% of fishing nets and 29% of fishing lines used globally are lost, abandoned, or otherwise discarded into the environment. That's an awful impact of what amounts to plastic pollution. At least 46% of the infamous Great Pacific Garbage Patch consists of ghost gear, and in Europe, this waste is among the 10 most common types of debris found on coasts and beaches. What's more, ghost nets kill. Ghost fishing occurs when abandoned gear continues to fish, indiscriminately entangling and suffocating many species for up to hundreds of years depending on its composition. Gill nets, the most prevalent type of ghost net, can extend down 10 to 50 feet deep and stretch up to 2 miles in length, capturing fish by entanglement. They continue to ensnare marine animals long after they've been abandoned and left dormant on the sea floor, to a shocking extent. One study estimated that about 4,500 recovered ghost nets had killed upwards of 2.5 million marine invertebrates, 800,000 fish, and 20,000 marine birds over the time they were derelict in the water. The problem is so endemic that dolphins have been observed biting through active nets, although that appears to be in an effort to get the food trapped inside rather than a heroic delphine rescue attempt. Nonetheless, it's not difficult to understand why there's been such a concerted effort over the past decade to highlight and address the issue, particularly by the UN. But even when fishing nets don't become ghost nets, they still have a limited lifespan as working nets, usually around a year of regular use. As the global shipping industry has continued expanding, disposing of an increasing amount of fishing nets that are well past their sell-by date has become a growing problem. This is particularly so in the EU with its strict environmental regulations, such as the European Directive on Single-Use Plastics, which includes actions to target the collection and recycling of old fishing nets. It's even more of a concern in Denmark, which ended up with piles of excess old fishing nets as a result of Brexit. When the UK left the EU in 2020, Danish fishermen lost much of their access to British waters, which had previously accounted for around 1/3 of the total annual Danish haul. While some found new waters, many were compelled to hang up their nets, which often simply ended up sitting in warehouses at harbours. A case in point is Tiburon, a fishing village of some 2,000 people in Jutland. In late 2024, around 450 tons of thick, 4mm nylon trawling nets had piled up and were sitting unused in its harbour. This is exactly the kind of netting the UAF was looking for, and in Tiburon, there was a man who could make it happen. Carl Futtrup, a 53-year-old gardener from the Copenhagen area, entirely uninvolved in the military, had been following the war keenly since Russia's invasion in February 2022. A firm supporter of Ukraine who had previously made donations to the cause, he had been contacted by Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines looking for nets. As Futtrup told Business Insider, "They write to me that they want more because without this, all other donations are worthless." That gives you a sense of just how important these nets have become to Ukraine's frontline defenses. Futtrup was aware of Tiburon's nets, found its fishermen on Facebook, and asked them if they were open to donating. They agreed, and just a few months later, by March 2025, over 400 tons of Tiburon's nets were being used in Ukraine to snag Russian drones like insects on flypaper. What's more, that's just the first portion of what Futtrup and other volunteers hope will ultimately be a total of 2.1 million tons of Danish commercial nets, protecting Ukrainian fortifications, equipment and roads. They've already secured a further 600 tons of donated trawl nets to send to Ukraine. The problem now is getting them there. The most efficient way of delivering these nets, the 775-odd miles from Copenhagen to Ukraine, is by truck, and that's expensive for the average man. Futtrup estimates that each truck can carry up to 20 tons of nets, and each trip will cost around $3,200, around $96,000 in total for the 600 tons. He's actively looking for donations to cover those costs and is working with the Danish government to develop a broader procurement and financing plan for further deliveries. But besides the transport costs, the nets are essentially free, donated by the small company or individual fishermen who own them. A trawling net is a substantial investment for small players like these. After Brexit made these nets redundant, many fishermen warehoused them, hoping for future opportunities. However, Danish environmental laws require such equipment to be disposed of or recycled eventually, and in Denmark, that's not cheap. So time is running out. Sending the nets to Ukraine makes both moral and financial sense. For now, there's a ready supply of Danish fishing nets available, provided funds to cover the transport costs can be found. And given the importance of the nets to the front lines, and the fact that the military aid package from Ukraine's partners tend to be valued in the hundreds of millions, if not billions, that shouldn't be too hard, should it? Nonetheless, this stockpile isn't going to last forever, and while a couple of kilotons from Denmark will be welcomed with open arms, Ukraine needs a whole lot more. A unit commander overseeing fortifications and mine-laying in the Donetsk direction told Business Insider that his battalion needs about 3 truckloads or roughly 60 tons of net a month. It then takes 3 or 4 days for his men to set up the miles-long tunnels of safe passages under the nets. First, they dig holes for poles next to the roadside. Then they unfold the large rolls of thin netting and lift them onto the poles. Futtrup's first shipment of 500 tons of netting equipped at least 13 such units on the front lines, according to Bernard Christensen, a Swede living in Ukraine who runs the NGO Operation Change. The NGO helps Ukrainian brigades find sources for netting and has provided over 250 metric tons in 2025. Christensen says one brigade needs 50 to 80 tons, so considering that Ukraine has dozens of brigades active on the front lines and many hundreds of miles to protect, it's no wonder that the search for netting has already been cast beyond Denmark. As the net-laying commander put it, Many units desperately need these marine nets. In recent months, local Ukrainian authorities have begun building net corridors in Sumy, where the Ukrainian forces are counterattacking a Russian incursion, and particularly, as we noted earlier, in Donetsk. In particular, a major focus is on securing the drone-vulnerable main access road leading into the embattled eastern city of Konstantinivka, which is otherwise surrounded from the east, south, and west. Christensen says Operation Change is looking to acquire nets from organizations cleaning up the western Swedish coast, but there are many other sources in Europe to explore, especially if there are funds to acquire nets instead of just relying on donations. In France, for example, 880 tons of fishing nets and 440 tons of trawls are used each year, with the used nets typically sent to landfill, incinerated, or shipped abroad for recycling. Although there aren't too many plants offering the service in Europe, recycling plastic fishing nets is a big, industrial-sized business. So Christensen and the UAF might face some competition from recyclers in trying to procure used fishing nets en masse. But with so many of Ukraine's partners deeply involved in the fishing industry, there are bound to be tens of thousands of tons of netting available, if not readily. Getting its hands on brand new netting isn't really feasible, at least not from the established fishing net manufacturing industry. At an estimated combined global annual output of around 272,700 tons, there's more netting lying around picturesque rural Danish harbors than the whole world produces every year. Perhaps if the financial incentive were compelling enough, some of these manufacturers might be willing and able to surge production capacity by orders of magnitude to meet Ukraine's needs. It's not nearly as difficult as trying to surge the capacity of, say, THAAD interceptor missiles. Come to think of it, given how the use of drones on the battlefield in the war in Ukraine has likely changed the way wars are fought everywhere, forever, a brand new multi-billion-dollar product line might be taking shape. But in the meantime, it seems a no-brainer for Ukraine's partners to start including fishing nets or indeed any type of drone-resistant netting in their military aid packages to Ukraine, where available, of course. As has been proven so often during this war, expensive high-tech weaponry can often be nullified by inexpensive, low-tech solutions. Fishing nets look like a quick and inexpensive way to make a huge difference to the embattled troops on the front line. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show to stay up to date with all the latest innovations on the battlefield in Ukraine and beyond. Thanks again to Supremacy World War III for sponsoring this video. Download the game for free using the link below and claim your exclusive $25 starter pack with a free seasonal unit of the main battle tank, only available for the next 30 days.